Hey everybody, it's Meredith Miller with Inner Integration. Today I'm here answering some more questions for you guys. These got voted on Facebook. So I'm going to start in order of the most popular questions. The first one, someone said maybe you could talk about what happens to the brain damage when someone is going through narcissistic abuse. That's a really great question. These are the changes that take place after a period of abuse. So first of all, I'm not a brain doctor. I only know a little bit about this. And actually, I also want to let you guys know, I don't know if you're aware of the World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day, which is June 1st and 2nd. Bree Bonche, she's a therapist from LA. She sets it up with a co-host, and she did this for the last 2 years. I'm going to be participating in this year, and I also saw on the roster there's at least one other person, if not two, talking about the neuro processes after trauma and abuse. So that's going to be a really, really interesting interview to catch. That's going to take place again on June 1st or 2nd. So be looking out for that if you haven't heard about that yet. But just to give you a little basis, in fact, this I included in my 12-week Sana course, which you can find on my website. And I think it was maybe week 7 or something. I need to check that again. But I talked about what happens, particularly in the limbic system, which is like emotions and memories. And so there's the amygdala, and then there's the hippocampus. And what happens is the amygdala is in charge of, let's say, emergency responses, anxiety, fear, this sort of stuff. So it's like this bunch of nerve cells. And what happens when you're consistently exposed to fear, to traumatizing situations, to emergency situations, a lot of nerve bundles, a lot of nerve connections form there. So it's like the amygdala gets enlarged, and then they say it's almost like a light switch where like it's permanently on, like the anxiety switch is permanently on. This is all built into our biology for biological reasons, right? For survival, for adapting to things, for processing things. I mean, these exist for normal reasons, but what happens in abuse is there's this over enlargement of this anxiety area. And so you're constantly on like an anxiety response to things. So what also happens is the amygdala works with the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is in charge of converting short-term to long-term memory. And what happens is all that energy goes to the amygdala, growing the nerve bundles there. And then the hippocampus ends up shrinking in terms of nerve connections there. And so what happens then is abuse amnesia, where your brain deletes it. Like you forget most of the things that happened. You might even forget most of your childhood. If you grew up in one of these situations, abuse, neglect, abandonment, I forget most of my childhood. I have glimpses only. You know, it's more like a vague dream. And my brother will tell me stories sometimes. He's amazing because he remembers everything in incredible detail. And when he tells me these stories, sometimes I feel like he's talking about someone else. And so what happens is, so say you're in the moment and there's so much tension and so much stress that your brain literally just deletes what's happening in order to survive, in order to keep yourself going, because it's entirely too much to process. So there's no conversion between the short and long-term memory, which is why you might also notice that like your memory retention, like maybe you're in school or you're just trying to learn something, and maybe like you notice you stare at this page for like 30 minutes and you keep staring at the same paragraphs and like you're just not getting it in. You can't digest it. Or maybe in school you notice that like you're just not as quick, or you don't have the capacity that you had before. I noticed this in the languages I speak. Like 20 years ago, I speak 5 languages. 20 years ago, 3 of them, including English, I spoke like at an absolute native level. Like natives would have confirmed that. And maybe I lost some in practice over the years, but I really believe that there was some changes in my brain that now it's not as easy for me to speak as fluently, as natively as I used to be able to speak those languages. I do believe that was caused by some sort of brain damage. And I think that doing work to strengthen the brain, to strengthen the nervous system, it can really help. It doesn't mean it's going to stay like this forever, but there's a long process of healing that takes place. Dr. Daniel Amen, it looks like Amen. Look him up. He is a brain specialist. He's read, I don't know, thousands of fMRI brain scans, and he just knows so much about helping people to recover after brain injuries. And he'll show you the before and after. Like, he worked with football players, like American football players who have so much brain damage from getting hit over and over, concussion after concussion. He shows you the original brain scan, and it's shocking. You know, maybe like a 40-year-old guy or 30-year-old guy has the brain of like a 70-year-old. And then he puts them on these supplements, and he does this training with them, and then like months or years later, their brain looks entirely different, how their brain is functioning. So I would look him up. He's a fantastic resource on the topic of brain health. You might be interested in things that he has to say. So I'm going to wrap that question up for now. And again, stay tuned to the World Narcissistic Abuse Awareness Day for the speaker who's going to be talking about the brain and trauma. The next question is, someone asked, how do you trust yourself again? How not to be hyper vigilant in future relationships? I feel like I should have been able to tell he really didn't love me, and I'm so afraid I will miss something in a future relationship. So it's really important when you're talking about self-trust or trust in general, we're talking about self-trust because it all starts with you. And probably what happened at the beginning, why you didn't realize that it wasn't real love, possibly this had happened before. Possibly this had been happening since childhood to one form of another. Maybe not necessarily one of your parents was a narcissist, though they could have been, even both of them. But there could have been some dynamic where you just, maybe they were both really busy and they were just never home and you just didn't really feel loved. And so if someone would give you some little breadcrumb of love, it was like, oh, this is so amazing. I feel so loved because of the environment that you had grown up in. You just didn't know otherwise. And so it could have been then that you get into an adult relationship and you recognize the love bombing as love. It feels good to you because maybe you never felt that. I mean, especially what if you were a scapegoat growing up? You never experienced love. You were just always put down. You're used as the rubbish bin for your entire family. And then maybe you meet this person as an adult who is just going over the top, and it looks like love. It looks like they care, but it's not. It's just love bombing. It's the seduction that they're doing to suck you in. And they know it's like they can pick out the people who are desperate for that kind of love bombing because they know they're going to get you hooked into that. That's probably what happened at the beginning when you didn't know because you didn't know any better. And probably also you didn't trust yourself because, again, if you had been in this situation before, and especially if you had grown up in it, you may not even know what self-trust is. And until you can trust yourself, you have no idea who you can trust. And it really comes down to the body more than anything. And that's why I've been talking about that a lot more lately. I did that one video on how your body will let you know you're in a toxic situation or with a toxic person. Use that. Use your body. Start to develop that connection where you're listening to your body. You're really feeling how you feel around certain people, how you feel when you think about certain people or going to certain situations, and always being aware of that and never discounting it ever again, even when the surface looks just fine, and so that's really, really important to be able to override all of the doubt, the plausible deniability that can be existing out here, what a person might be telling you, what it might look like on the surface, and to trust yourself, because it could go one of two ways. One, it could be a bad situation, and if you don't trust yourself, maybe you're getting the stomach drop, you're getting like the intense anxiety, you're feeling like you have to go to the bathroom, your eyes are twitching, like something's going on in your body, but you're just like, no, it's just nothing, it's not related. And then later you find out the truth about whatever's been going on. It was like, oh yeah, my body was trying to tell me that. It can also work the other way around, where say you meet a good person and something's going on in their life, like they're feeling insecure or they're extremely stressed, and maybe you don't know them well enough for this person to feel like they can tell you what's going on. And so they don't tell you. And so maybe that you feel them more distant, and maybe you're starting to panic thinking, oh, here it is again. It's going to be ghosting. It's going to be just like the past, but maybe it's not, right? But if you listen to your body, and there really are no signs, like, you know your body, you trust your body, you know the kind of signs that you get when things aren't right, but there's no signs, there's nothing going on, then you know that you can trust until you see other proof otherwise. So that's why it's so important, whether for good or for bad, to be able to trust your body. And that self-trust, really, it starts with the body because it's tangible. It's so much easier. Eventually, you're going to refine that self-trust ability to where you just get this instant idea. You just know something suddenly, and it's true. It turns out to be true. And you may not have proof in the moment, but you trust it because you start to learn, oh yeah, when I have that sudden insight, and it wasn't like I was sitting and churning and thinking about it, but it was that sudden insight that came out of nowhere that told me blah, 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 blah. And that's actually what happened. So that's the piece on like listening to the intuition, developing the self-trust. The other piece of that is your integrity. Are you in integrity with yourself? Because if you're not in integrity with yourself, if your values are not aligned with your vision, and I did another video on that a few weeks ago, check that out if you haven't. If you are not in integrity with yourself, you're compromising your values to stay in connection with someone else, or you're making poor decisions out of fear or lack or something, and you're not making decisions in alignment with your values, then you're out of integrity and you can't trust yourself. And even if you don't rationalize that and explain it to yourself in a cognitive, intellectual way, you know it. Like, your subconscious knows when you're out of integrity and you can't trust yourself. And if you can't trust yourself, you have no idea who else you can trust. If you can't trust yourself to make decisions in integrity, how are you going to trust somebody else to make decisions in integrity? So those are the two really big important pieces in terms of rebuilding that self-trust in order so that you can trust others, or recognize when you can't. So next question is, how to explain to people why I went no contact with my narcissistic mother. People don't generally have a lot of knowledge about narcissism, and I don't really have the energy or will to explain. It's especially hard since my mom always plays the victim, and everyone has seen her as so nice and helpful when she's really a devil in disguise. So yeah, this is a really, really big deal when you fully recognize who your mother could be, a person's father. In this case, we're talking about the mother. Someone in your family, you realize who your mother is, and you know that you have to go no contact in order to protect your health, your sanity, your well-being, your peace, your success, your growth in this life. And you make that decision because finally you get to that point where you value more those things, your health, your sanity, your well-being, your peace, your success, your growth in life, your relationships. When you get to the point where you value all of that more than whatever anybody else is going to say, that's when you know you're making that decision for the right reasons. And then it gets a lot easier to think about, do you need to explain that to anybody? How would you even present this to somebody? And what you'll find when you're talking about the mother, especially, I think in society, there's more ideas about the absentee father, the deadbeat father. And, guys, I love you guys too. I'm not saying like all of you guys are like that, but, the typical stereotype that you hear. And so it's almost like there's kind of like this, oh yeah, he's just one of those guys kind of deal. But you talk about a mother like that, and suddenly people are freaking out. I mean, especially you're talking about Latino cultures, Italian cultures, Greek cultures, Jewish cultures. You tell somebody that you've cut off your mother and watch their faces, like look at their energy. It's like how could somebody do that? How could an adult child not want to have contact with their own mother? And they might judge you in that way. They might not get it. And so what you might find is that you have to be very selective in terms of who you share that information with. Can they be trusted with that information, or are they going to pass some sort of judgment and put you down and tell you why you're wrong for doing that. Maybe because they're making their own projections, or they just don't get it, or maybe they're defending her. Maybe they know her and she's super covert and they just don't see it, and they just think she's Martha fucking Stewart or whoever, you know, she pretends to be, this idealized version of whatever a mother is or a housewife or something, and people just don't see it. My advice would be, don't waste your time trying to get them to see it. Don't waste your time. Don't waste your energy. Don't get exasperated trying to convince somebody of your reality, of your truth, because it's just not worth it. It's just not. You might mention a thing or two and gauge their response, and the person's like moving away, or they're passing judgments, or they're telling you why you're wrong. Step away. You know, immediately change the subject, and then really evaluate if you want that person in your life or not. And my suggestion would be to cut out of your life all of the sympathizers of her abuse, all of them. The ones who don't see it, or who are like her and sympathize with it, or, you know, who just want to justify, well, you know, nobody's perfect and every mother does the best they can. Just stay away from that kind of stuff, because it's really going to confuse your sense of sanity. Your sense of sanity. Don't let people pull you into their realities. So you just got to get to that point where you develop enough self-trust and self-worth that you know that was one of the best decisions, if not the best decision of your entire life, because you see the results of what happens after you go no contact with her. You've got to value yourself more, your sanity, your health, your well-being more, and then you're just not going to care as much about what those people think and what they're saying. And it might occur to you now and then, oh, wow, I wonder what so-and-so is saying about me, or there was a family reunion, and can you imagine the gossip circle there? And if you haven't seen the video I did on gossip and narcissists, check it out, especially if you have a narcissistic mother, because you're probably just going to laugh. That's probably going to look a lot like what she does. And just let them go. Just let them gossip and just churn up all that negative, toxic energy and just sit in it themselves. And you're out here. That's not my reality. That's not my reality. So every time, you know, those thoughts come by to invite you to doubt yourself, or to feel like you're not good enough, or like you have to explain yourself, or like you have to argue or defend yourself to these people who just don't see it, remind yourself that is not my reality. That's not my reality. And you might even need to be careful with siblings. I don't know in this case, you know, if there's siblings, it could be that your siblings don't see it. It could be some of your siblings are narcissistic. It could also be that some of your siblings are codependent and people pleasers, and they just don't want to see it. Or maybe you were the golden child and your sibling was the scapegoat, like most of the life, although maybe your parents, your narcissistic mother might have gone back and forth a little bit, you know, on the golden child and the scapegoat, but maybe you figured it out as the golden child. You got out, you called it out, and now what happens is the narcissistic mother is now idealizing and love bombing the child who was once the scapegoat. Now that child is the golden child and you're the scapegoat. And if that former scapegoat child has never received love bombing, just only criticism and cruelty and putting down, not good enough and all that, they're just sucked in, because they're like, oh my God, mom changed. Mom changed. She's different now. She was never like this before. But really, they're just being idealized. They're just being love bombed because she's desperate to maintain some kind of supply. And that sibling might be a really good-hearted, empathic, loving person that you might have been really close to before. And you might now need to have all new boundaries with that sibling because they don't get it, because they're in deep. And maybe they're trying to convince you to come back into the family dynamics, the crabs pulling you back in the pot when you're trying to get out. So you really have to focus on valuing yourself, on validating your reality, and on owning your reality, and not getting sucked in to that reality where you feel like you have to defend yourself or justify your decisions and who you are for those people. Someone asked, can you say something about narcissists and children? Mine was obsessed with our little girl, but completely different with our little boy. He seems to care about children, but I know he expects something back, like unconditional love and admiration. He uses them also to manipulate and control me. That's also very common with both narcissistic mothers and fathers, or psychopathic mothers and fathers, where they'll usually pick a golden child and a scapegoat, they're always going to use those kids as pawns against you. Always. Always, in some way, shape, or form, they're going to use them. And it could be that they're doing it for triangulation. They're treating you like shit, but then they're adoring the kids and they're giving the kids everything. And the kids are like, oh, mommy, or oh, daddy, and then you're sitting over there like seething in anger. Like, what is going on here? Or, they're giving the child everything the child wants. They're making you look like the bad parent, like the parent who doesn't want to allow them to do whatever. And they're not setting any boundaries, which is also very dangerous. To have no boundaries with kids, they're likely going to grow up to be narcissistic, psychopathic, because they were just entitled to everything and they did whatever they want. And so what you will probably notice is that the older the kids get, and the more of an individualized sense of self they have, because right now they're like extensions of the narcissistic parent. They're used to feed the narcissistic parents, narcissistic supply, ego, sense of self, whatever. But once the child or children start to develop their own sense of individuality and maybe they no longer want to do what the narcissistic parent wants, like maybe the narcissistic parent wants the child to become a doctor and they've been pumping this into the child from the beginning and the child's like, actually, I'm going to be an artist, and then the narcissistic parent is freaking out because now the child is no longer following, that path that they wanted them to follow to make them feel good and be like, yeah, my child's doctor and my millionaire son and whatever. Now they don't get to do that. My child's now a poor, starving artist. Or in a case where maybe there's a really machista father, or maybe it could be a mother too. They're just like a very fundamentalist sort of religious background where they judge homosexuality and one of their children turns out to be gay, and for them that's just like unforgivable. And so now, they start abusing that child, or maybe the child picks the wrong partner that the narcissistic parent doesn't approve of. And now, there's problem with the child because the child is standing up and telling the parent, back off, I'm picking this person over you. Those kinds of things will come up the more the kids start to individualize themselves. You might also notice what they call PASS, the parental alienation syndrome, where the narcissistic, psychopathic, or other manipulator parent, it's like poisons the mind of the kid against the other parent, the good parent. And what will happen, which is very sad, is that the kids will often identify with the abusive parent because they feel their power. And unconsciously, they're identifying with the parent with power because they don't want to be the parent without the power. They don't want to be abused like that. They don't want to be treated like that. And they might be so young that this isn't even a cognitive understanding or process for them, but at some deep subconscious level, they see that. And you're wondering, how in the world, are they sympathizing with this parent? They've seen how the other parent treats you, and they're still identifying with them. Maybe they choose to live with them, or they defend that other parent in front of you. It's because of this. That kid is identifying with the power. And that's very sad when that happens. This definitely happens where they will use the kids to control you. They'll send messages back through the kids. I've heard all sorts of things like that. You've basically signed up for a lifetime of boundary lessons when you're co-parenting with one of these characters, and it's going to be a challenge with the kids for sure. The older they get, the more chance there is of them waking up and realizing, and the stronger and the healthier you get as the other parent, the more you're going to set that path free for them. You're going to be the lighthouse, which is guiding them to shore from the storm at sea where they're living. And that depends on you. And that's why you have to come first. That's why you are your number one responsibility, because the more healthy you get, the more sane you get, the better you feel about yourself, the more empowered you are. Your kids are going to look at you and be like, wow, look at mommy, look at daddy. Like, wow, I want to be like that. And so they're going to start to look up to you more because they see you're not a doormat anymore. You're not just going to allow, your ex-husband or your ex-wife to treat you that way. You now have all different standards and boundaries and ways of being, and that you're then teaching these kids that, one, they're not going to put up with that kind of stuff. They're not going to then attract someone like their father or their mother who's abusive, which is very likely to happen if you don't do anything about it. Sorry about that siren. Or they're going to they're going to grow up and model your strategy, your defense strategy, which is codependency, and then they're just going to keep attracting abusive people after abusive people. That's why you have to lead the way. As daunting as that must be at times, and I can only imagine, you have to lead the way. And when it gets really tough, you just got to keep taking care of yourself and getting better and loving yourself more and respecting yourself more and getting in integrity and empowering yourself and leading by example and showing your kids the way out. Somebody else asked, how can you get past wanting to give your side of the story to the narcs in terms of the family and friends? Like, it sounds like dealing with the smear campaign and justifying. And so that goes back to that question I was talking about earlier with the narcissistic mother in the family. It's really the same thing that applies to groups of friends, though the dynamics aren't as strong as they are in the family. But the same advice would apply to that situation. Someone else is asking, when you're in a new and committed relationship after being through narcissistic abuse and you're triggered with your new guy or girl, right, by things he's doing that remind you of things that happened with the narcissist, how do you distinguish between your intuition and your insecurities? She said she feels like she's always paranoid, and when something little comes up, she overreacts or has to remind herself this guy isn't a narcissist. She said it's difficult to differentiate between what's trigger and being triggered and what's the intuition. How do I manage the triggers? I do believe this guy is a man of quality, integrity, and has in no way treated me like the narcissist, but I'm triggered by little things that would not have been an issue before the narcissist. So it could be either of those things that are going on. It could be that those insecurities are coming up. Those insecurities haven't been healed. You started dating before really healing those things, and so things are still cloudy and uncertain. You don't really trust yourself yet, because if you trust yourself, then you're going to recognize those body signals that I was mentioning earlier when we talked about the self-trust. So everything I said earlier about the self-trust applies to this case. So let's bring that in as well. And being able to trust yourself and know, like, is this my intuition, or is this like a trigger and an insecurity? And in the initial dating, like, say you finally meet someone who's not on that cluster B spectrum, and it sounds like this person isn't. Say you finally meet somebody who's not on that spectrum, but still you're having some weird feelings. It could still be that your intuition is warning you of something, because just because that person isn't a narcissist doesn't mean something might happen where that person hurts you or does something that ends up making you feel sad or hurt or abandoned in some ways that kind of reminds you of the narcissist, but wasn't the way that the narcissist would have gone about it. Here's one example. And the tough part is sometimes this stuff is only noticeable in retrospect, because in the moment you don't have all the proof. That's why I really recommend listening to your body and taking note of things, like writing in a journal, writing down somewhere the things that you notice, that even if they don't make sense in the moment, because they might make a lot more sense down the road. For example, I dated a guy for 4 months, and he was a kind, tender, good guy. And it was amazing because it wasn't like any of the cluster B things before. There was none of that tension of like always feeling like you were on edge and what was coming next and what were they going to say. That wasn't there. There were no arguments. There was not even one argument ever. There was no disagreeable, unpleasant moment at any point during those 4 months. It was great. But every time he would leave, I got sad, and there was no reason to. Every single time that he left, it was like this almost overwhelming sadness in my body. And I was like, where is this even coming from? It makes no sense. Everything was great. We just had a great time. We're still going to be in contact. I'm going to see him again whenever. And everything was just fine. But that sadness, and I kept noting that in my mind because it just seemed so odd. And just like you, I was asking myself, like, is this a trigger? Is this an insecurity? Is this the past? Is this me confusing the past with the present? Or does this mean something? Well, it was in my body. 4 months later, turns out this guy got a job offer in Asia and he's moving, and he didn't know how to tell me. And because he wasn't emotionally mature enough to just tell me that he had to leave, he just disappeared. Now, eventually, a week later, I knew this had happened. Like, I knew the moment it was going to happen. My stomach fell. Like, he had left his guitar here for 4 months, and he went to restring it. He took it with him. And in that moment, my stomach fell. I knew I was never going to see him again. But again, that didn't make any sense because everything was great. We were having a great time. There was no discussion of anything. There was no arguments. There was no possibility that that was going to be changing. But I knew. And so a week later, I wrote him an email, and he wrote back and admitted that he just didn't know how to tell me, and he wanted me to be with somebody who could be here with me and my dog, and he was going to be leaving, and blah, blah, blah. Well, then I realized, I was like, that was it. My body was trying to tell me the whole time that every time he left, at some point he was going to leave, and that was going to be the last time I was going to see him, and that was going to be really sad because it wasn't even going to make any sense. So it was an intuition after all. Though at the time, it seemed more like maybe it was my past insecurities and that sort of thing. So bottom line is, if it's happening in your body, I would really listen to that. It means something. It means something. And it doesn't necessarily mean that's a bad person. That guy wasn't a bad person. He was not emotionally mature. He didn't handle that in the right way. But we had a really great time for 4 months. He treated me really well for 4 months until the confrontation happened and he couldn't confront because he didn't have the courage to do so. So he just disappeared. So it might be that something like that is hiding under the surface and it's not really clear yet. If you're feeling it in your body, pay attention. So this video went pretty long already. I'm going to wrap this up for now. There's so many great questions here. I really wrote down a lot of the more common ones, and I'll be able to use these in some videos in the future. Some of them I think need like a whole video for itself. So I'm going to keep some of these in my file over here to use in the future, and I'm sending you all a big hug.